dogs. I have to wear snowshoes. um, so thank you so much for being here today. And what we're going to do today is we're going to kind of discuss issues around language when it comes to people with disabilities. So I'm going to walk you through a PowerPoint, but before I do that, I kind of wanted to tell you a little bit about what we're going to do today. I tried to make this really interactive, but also comfortable. And I'm going to do the same thing next week. We have a training, a 3-hour training session on racism and ableism next week. And I'm going to do a similar thing where we're going to have a lot of poll questions so that people can interact without feeling the thing that when people are learning new terminology or concepts and stuff, it's hard to be interactive if you're afraid of saying something wrong. So I don't want anybody to worry about that. So I've created today a series of polls around terminology, and then we'll discuss them after each poll. We'll discuss the language. Okay, so I'm gonna pull up the PowerPoint and share my screen. Leah, you should feel free at any point in time to enter questions or comments in the chat. And Leah will watch the chat for me and she'll jump in. I'll periodically ask her if there's any questions, but she'll jump in when there are any. We've been doing this together. We've got a good rhythm now. So, okay, so I'm going to share my screen, my PowerPoint, and get started. So we're talking about, so I'm hoping that you're just seeing just the one slide. And we're talking about words and exploring language and labels for survivors with disabilities. So we're going to talk about the use of language today when we're talking about how someone identifies. And we do this all the time, but not as many people are focused on how people with disabilities identify. And so this, I thought, would be a good kind of opportunity for us to learn more about this. And let me just say, because I forgot to kind of do all the things that I normally do when I introduce myself. So my name is Olga Trujillo. My pronouns are they, them. I identify as a person with a disability. I have dissociative identity disorder, which I've done trainings on for NC CASA, which the recordings are available if you want to learn more about that. And you can always email me. My email is on this first slide. Sorry, it's kind of small. But you can always email me if you want to learn more about dissociative identity disorder. Sorry, here we go. I have slides for this. Okay, so our goals and objectives today are to explore the history and differences between people first language and identity first language, this is really kind of a big shift in the disability world. And among, as well as in other areas, but in the disability world in particular. And then we're going to examine the importance of using preferred language when addressing people with disabilities. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And we'll examine the ways in which language choice reflects the autonomy and decision-making of disabled people. So what I was hoping we could do, because there's not a huge amount of you, is I was hoping that we could just kind of introduce ourselves, who you are, so name, pronouns, the program and position that you're in. And we can do this any way you want, meaning that I think it'll be easier, Amanda, for you to do it verbally, which we already know a little bit about you, but and other folks can unmute and jump in and say, who they are, or you can do this in the chat. And we'll just read the chat so that Amanda can, hears who's here. And so if you could, how about if I just, okay, cool. Christina Richard, she, her pronouns, shelter director with Onslow Women's Center. Awesome. Thank you so much, Christina. Amanda, do you want to say a little bit more? Do you want to unmute and say a little bit more about you're at Fort Bragg, but your position and the program you're in? Okay, and while we're waiting, Peace O'Delly and has introduced herself, Lakeisha, she, her pronouns, New Horizons court advocate. Actually, I might need help, Leah. I don't think I can keep up.
I mean, do you want to go?
Oh,
I
and
see you're muted.
Yeah, go ahead, Amanda.
Oh, hello, Olga and Leah. I'm Amanda, military. I'm a battalion victim advocate. I've came from Korea, so this is a little different, but I'm, yep.
Okay.
Here at Fort Bragg until I know any different.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Wow, that is a big change.
Thank you.
And okay, so I see Lakeisha, New Horizons court advocate, then Jess Minnick, she, her, DASI, and she's a domestic violence liaison. And Peace, you're with the House of Ruth. So you're in Baltimore, right? Maryland? Unless there's another one.
Yes, I am Baltimore, Maryland, and I work as a service coordinator as well.
Awesome. I'll just say the Ravens are the football team that I root for because they're in purple. I grew up in Maryland, DC area, and they have a name that is a poem. Like, who does that?
I really like that.
Awesome.
I like them too, just not this season.
No, not this season. But I live really close to Minnesota, so I don't root for the Green Bay Packers, and Minnesota's season was way worse.
Well, I actually like the Packers are my second favorite team.
Oh, they are? Oh, you must be having fun then this year because they're doing really well.
Because I like the Ravens better. So it's like half and half,
Yeah, totally agree. Okay. Sorry for anybody who is a Carolina Panthers fan. Okay, so then Anna Clausen, court advocate at Safe Home for Everyone. Amelia Wilkerson, she, her pronouns. How do you pronounce that? Is that Passaic? County Women's Center. Passaic. Okay, awesome. Thank you. And you're a CSVA coordinator. And then we have Ruby Berganza, she, her pronouns, Onslow Women's Center, DVSA advocate. Awesome. We have Sue Levine or Levine. I never know how to pronounce that. Sorry. 180 Turning Lives Around. Oh, you're in New Jersey. Wow. Cool. So welcome, Sue. It's fun to see people. I mean, I always expect people to be from North Carolina, so I get excited when there are other people. Sorry, don't mean to make you all feel like you're, second fiddle in North Carolina. You're not. Okay, and then there's Heather Scott with Domestic Violence Response Team, and also in New Jersey. Kimberly, who, she, her pronouns, DVSA, victim advocate, Onslow. Courtney Riseborough, I'm hoping I pronounced that right. from Domestic Abuse and Sexual Assault Services of Warren County, Vulnerable Populations Program Manager. Okay, so that's what I kind of wanted to know. So Courtney, you work with either seniors or with people with disabilities, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Both populations and also the deaf and hard of hearing community.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, perfect. That's kind of part of what I'm trying to figure out. If most folks, it seems like, are advocates working on either domestic violence or sexual assault or possibly human trafficking and want to learn more about working with people with disabilities. And then there are some people that are working specifically with people with disabilities or elders or deaf people. So cool. Okay, so we have Bernadette, a DV advocate at Wayne Uplift, she, her pronouns, awesome. Erin Snyder, Rutgers University, I know where that is. So that is not in North Carolina. Welcome, awesome. And Nina, also from Sussex County in New Jersey. We got a lot of New Jersey people. What was the deal with that? That's cool. Jose, he, him, services empowering, also in New Jersey. That is very awesome. Rochelle, and we have Sarah. I'm the long-term case manager at the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Crisis Center in Warren County. And then we have a Packers fan. All right. Is it Juana? Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Say Joanna, yes. So it's
Juana. Thank you so much. Okay, so Juana, right?
Mhm.
Okay, I just want to make sure I'm saying it right because
That's all
I grew up
right.
with the name Olga Trujillo.
And that's
the
in New
DC
Jersey as
area.
well.
Oh, you're New Jersey too? All right. Lots of New Jersey folks today. That's awesome. Oh, and in Onslow, it's snowing today. Really? Oh no, showing up today. Onslow is showing up today. Sorry, I got snow on the brain. All right, so awesome. Okay, so a couple things. Thank you so much for introducing yourselves. Thank you so much for using the chat and also for your spirit in the chat too. I love that. It makes it way more dynamic. Okay, so I'm gonna ask you to go back to the chat again or to unmute. And here's kind of what I wanted to know. Is there something in particular that you were looking for in today's session? And this is just for me to like either one, cover it if I can, or two, for planning in the future, or it might be something that I have resources that I can refer you to and I can send those to Leah and she can send them out to everyone. So if there's anything in particular that you wanted to learn today, it's totally fine to just be here because you just want to learn about language and people with disabilities. So I'll just wait a little bit and see what we've got in the chat or if anyone unmutes. And while we're waiting, I'll actually also do a little caveat, which is that I have my Black Lab Bruce in the room with me because if I don't, he'll get into stuff in the kitchen because he's very smart and motivated. He has opened our refrigerator, our freezer, has climbed up onto our counters and gotten the peanut butter. So he stays with me. So if somebody does brave the driveway, because most people don't in the wintertime, but if somebody does, then he'll bark. Okay, so Christina, a New Jersey girl living in North Carolina who misses New Jersey and roots for Scarlet Knights, wanted to know just kind of general knowledge. We've been recently working with more disabled individuals. More knowledge will allow us to better advocate for the individuals we serve. Awesome, perfect. Aaron, best practice, I find that the appropriate language shifts if I do not regularly participate in these educational opportunities and I fall out of touch totally. I'm right there with you, Aaron. Jose, how to welcome survivors living with a disability into our program without alienating them by ensuring all accommodations are prioritized. Awesome. Cool. And then peace, how to be more conscious of individuals with disabilities on picking up nonverbal cues and knowing the appropriate ways to respond. Perfect. Cool. So some of you might also want to attend next week's training. It's a 3-hour training on ableism and racism, where we're going to talk also about, how these two things kind of come together and make it difficult. We'll get into a little bit of that today, but some of that we'll talk about, which I think will help. All right. Well, that all sounds really awesome. So I'm gonna, and I think I'm gonna be able to get to a lot of this. Oh yeah, so Kimberly's asking about the training. So it is next Thursday, right, Leah? From 10 to 1 Eastern time. Awesome. Okay, so why does language matter? And I'm sure a lot of you are gonna feel this. And so this is like, it's really, really interesting to me for lots and lots of reasons. But if you look at the history of ableism in the US, it's been really damaging to disabled people who have experienced a long history of erasure, exploitation, stigma, and misunderstanding. I was doing some research for this webinar, and there's like this just really awful history of what were called ugly laws, which meant that anybody with a disability, this was like in the early 1900s, late 1800s, anybody with a disability had to be hidden, institutionalized. And it's only been really in more recent history that we have kind of thought of people with disabilities differently, and that is because of the disability rights movement. Ableism in our society has fostered a view that we are defective because of what makes us different. People with disabilities have been referred to by many derogatory names over the years. And often people were referred to by medical professionals or education providers, family members, and more in ways that made them uncomfortable or centered their disability over their personhood. So there are so many ways still in our language today that is marginalizing of people with disabilities. And then when you think about people of color with disabilities, the multiple marginalization that they feel is even worse. And so racism and ableism has been used in our society to really create a system where difference was not okay, either physical, mental, and skin color. Like all of it is not okay. Like, and kind of generalizing challenges that people might have, or the differences that people might have across race and ability, versus individualizing any time a person without a disability or a white person was doing something. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but it's kind of painting people that are different with a brush that they are less than. And that's been our history. And really, when it comes to people with disabilities, it's been our history very, very recently. And so in an effort to center their voices and experiences as human beings, people with disabilities have made efforts to own their own disability. And they have evolved in their thinking about themselves. And I'll just tell you that for me, I have gone from being ashamed that I have DID and making sure that no one finds out. So I went from that when I first found out I had DID to being someone who's actually very proud of the creativity and power that it took to survive the extensive abuse that I experienced as a child when I had to form parts because I couldn't physically escape what was happening to me. So I went from hiding my disability to being proud of how I survived. And I think of myself and what makes my brain different as a superpower. And I do, and when I'm with other people that have DID, we do talk about being multiple or plural, and owning that. And then we talk about people who don't have DID as being singletons, or in a joking way as being mere mortals. So it's that superpower kind of identity that we're grasping onto. And it's just as a way of showing growth in our field and in our, and for me over the course of my lifetime, as an example for how people have kind of viewed themselves and their disability versus how our society has viewed them. If you think about it, dissociative identity disorder, or DID, is one of the most stigmatized disorders that someone could have. So anyway, and really, if you've ever met anyone that has DID, the best way to think about it is DID is not the problem. DID shows a strength and creativity in surviving. It's the abuse that happened to them that required them to be so creative to survive. That's the problem. So these evolutions in thinking have led people with disabilities to identify in different ways. So people are in different parts of their evolutionary process of their thinking about themselves. I facilitate as part of my job with the Vera Institute of Justice, I facilitate a Black and Brown caucus of people with disabilities. So Black and Brown people with disabilities talking about and supporting each other around the issues of racism and ableism. So the person first language has been what we've seen in our society. We refer to people with disabilities. That has really been kind of where we landed. But now a person with a disability might then not be able to see themselves outside of the disability, meaning some people want to identify as a person first, and this disability is part of who they are. And some people cannot imagine themselves without the thing that makes them different. And so then identify first with the disability, because you can't pull it apart. And that's the way they kind of think about it. And it's kind of how I've gotten to where I am. Like, you can't pull out that fact that I have parts. I've learned how to move through the world as if I'm one, but I'm not one. So I think of myself as someone who has DID, and it affects everything in my life. I can't separate it out from anything else, so I don't know if that makes any sense. So the evolution. Yes. Sorry, I missed that. What was?
Sorry, everyone. My cat just stepped on my keyboard and just unmuted briefly.
Oh, gotcha. No problem. I love that. Okay, so these evolutions in thinking have led people with disabilities to identify in different ways. The rationale behind this is that we need to center the person, not the disability. But the evolution of the approach was to counter the ableism and derogatory language society as a whole has aimed at people with disabilities. So some people identify and embrace person first language, and some people identify and embrace identity first language. And identity has led to strong emotions about the language we use. And also some people don't see their disability, like I said, I don't see DID as a limitation. I see it as like, I've got these really great skills. The fact that, so I don't know if that makes any sense, but it's the idea of putting your identity first and your pride behind it. It's a little bit like, like what we do in the like Pride Month for LGBTQ, that was so stigmatized and marginalized that, but we're really proud of who we are. And this is the same kind of evolution that's happening in the disability world.
Yeah, Olga, and
but there's yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
no, you're fine. I was just going to lift up. There was a comment in the chat that said, I love the idea of viewing your difference as a superpower, beautiful reframe. So I think it's really resonating with other people, what you're saying.
Awesome. Awesome. Thanks so much, Leah. So the most important thing to remember, and we're going to come back to this over and over again, is that it's however the person chooses to identify that's important, and those choices should be respected. There is no right way to identify. So honoring that person's choices is what's most important. And the best practice is to ask each and every person what their preference is and reflect that preference. And it's a little bit like, how we identify in terms of gender. So what I want to do then is kind of look at terminology and kind of help everyone kind of see where we are around terminology. I'm in a lot of meetings with policy folks, with congressional staff. I do a lot of policy work. With people that I've worked with nationally in the domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking field that really don't know very much about people with disabilities. So I thought that really kind of the best place to start is with language and terminology. So the reason that language matters so much is because language affects how we think. Like when people use demeaning and marginalizing language, that's how people start thinking about it. Dehumanizes the target, the person that they're talking about, or the group of people they're talking about. And if they say, well, it's political correctness, that's not true, because language is so powerful. It shapes how we think. And that's what the intent is on their part. And so to look at ableism as a system, and then also that ableism assigns value to people's bodies and minds based on a view of what is normal. And there's this really great ableism guide that that we recently put out. And it's in plain language, and it's designed for self-advocates. So people with disabilities that are working on, we have a whole network of self-advocates that can provide support for other people with disabilities that are doing policy work or practice work. Anyway, it's a really great kind of way of describing and looking at how ableism shows up in our society. And it really kind of comes back to every type of oppression where difference is seen as less than. So a view that people with disabilities are defective rather than simply different. And people with disabilities have been referred to by many derogatory names over the years, and there have been efforts to erase, exploit, stigmatize, and really a lot of misunderstanding. And so over the years, we've been talking a lot about white privilege and recognizing whether you have it or not. And that's a little bit why I'm doing this training next week, is really these two things have been used racism and ableism has been used historically as a system. It is how we have taken land from Native Americans. It is how we've taken kids away from Native Americans and put them in boarding schools. It is how we have taken justified the ways in which in our country we treat brown and black people and have historically done that. So looking at it is really important as we do that. And we all of us, including myself, all have ableism. We're all doing it because it's really hard to think about the privilege that you have of being able to see, hear, smell, talk, walk, like all of that. And we're so used to doing all those things that you don't think about what a privilege that is. So I kind of want to center ableism in our thoughts today. But what I want to really kind of get into is some of the language that has been used over the past and that's being used now. So we're going to do that through a series of poll questions, identifying the language and then discussing the terms that we're using. So, all right, so let's do our first poll, Leah.
I think Alexandra is on now. I think, Alexandra, you have to launch it.
Okay, so here it is. Term uses. So here's the question. Should we still use the term able-bodied? So yes or no?
Alexandra, can you launch the poll?
Yeah, I see it.
Oh, okay. I don't know why I don't, but okay, good.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see it and people are filling it out. This is awesome. Thanks, Aaron. Aaron also saw it. Okay. So yeah, I don't want to say anything until we're done. And how many people? Oh yeah, we still have. Okay, so I think that's everybody. All right, so it's 67% of folks say no and 33% of folks say yes. Okay, so this one is a little bit more recent of a change. So the thing about able-bodied is that it makes it sound like people with disabilities lack quote unquote able bodies or their ability to use their bodies well. So we're not using the term able-bodied anymore. What we want to do is talk about either people with disabilities or people without disabilities. So, and it's because, again, this is how ableism kind of slips right in. It's like, okay, you either have an able-bodied or you don't. That becomes the measure, where it's really this person who might be a wheelchair user, they're using their body the way they've always been able to use their body and are doing things differently. Okay, can we go to the, so, and then Leah, will you keep an eye on the chat to see if there's any questions and jump in?
Yes.
Okay, awesome, thanks. I knew you were doing that, but I just had to say it anyway. Okay, so let's do the next one. So are we using addict or addiction? And these aren't all really clear cut. So don't feel bad, like if you're saying yes or no, and you're, you know, and because this is kind of the whole point of this. All right, so we're at Yeah, this one's a little bit harder, isn't it? I love the nuance. Okay, so yeah, so it's 53% are saying no, we shouldn't be using the word addict or addiction, and 47% say yes. That's an acceptable term to use. And this one is not really clear cut. So some people are using the term now, substance abuse disorder. And there's also still some tension among the term disorder because it's pathologizing. It's a little bit tricky. So addiction still is an acceptable term, but some people prefer substance abuse disorder. And so the key here is that addiction is a very specific thing as opposed to dependency. So someone may become dependent on a type of medication or drug or alcohol, but not have an addiction. So to be using addiction is totally fine, but making sure that we're using it correctly. So it's a little bit like the word trigger. There's a mental health terminology for trigger that is a somatic experience, right? It's a neurobiological experience. And then people use that term colloquially to talk about something that makes them feel uncomfortable. So I'm not sure if that makes sense. I'm hoping it does. Okay, so addiction is still, and this is really great, how even this is. This just shows you how nuanced it is. Addiction is still fine to use. Some people are using substance abuse disorder. All right, let's move to the next one then. Okay. All right, American Sign Language, whether that's appropriate to use or not. Awesome. You guys are really good. Okay. I think we still might have a couple people that haven't voted, but let me just go ahead because the trend is really clear. Yeah, so 86% of folks believe, yes, that American Sign Language is still the appropriate term to use. 14% say no, it is still the appropriate term to use. But basically what you're doing is you're going to say American Sign Language and you can say ASL. But remember, the key here is not every deaf person speaks American Sign Language or signs, knows ASL. So don't assume that there's a lot of things that you don't want to assume around people who are deaf. One, deaf people do not consider the fact that they are deaf to be a disability. A lot of people refer to themselves as deaf as a cultural experience, as well as the fact that they don't have hearing. And deaf is capitalized. There is some tension among the disability world of people who don't like the fact that that people who are deaf consider themselves to not have a disability. So there is a little bit of tension there, but for the most part, deaf people, you capitalize deaf, it's their own community, it's a cultural group, and American Sign Language is perfectly fine, or ASL, speak about an ASL interpreter, but then don't assume that everyone who is deaf knows American Sign Language. Okay, next one. And then please, yeah, just let me know if you have any questions, if I'm being unclear, because the whole point of this is to kind of look behind what's going on with language. So alcoholic, is this still an okay term to use? So alcoholic is, and I'm gonna wait till people finish voting, but alcoholic is a good example of identity language. Okay, I think that's everybody. So again, 63% of folks are saying no, it's not an appropriate term to use, and 38% are saying yes. So this is actually moving away. We're not using this so much anymore because it identifies someone simply by the fact that they have alcoholism. And so people first language is what's appropriate here. So it would be a person with alcoholism or a person who's, you know, who has alcohol addiction. Okay, and hopefully that makes sense to folks. So it's not, there isn't like a clear cut rule around identity first or people first language. Okay, let's move to the next term. Okay. I'm not seeing, sorry, Alexandra, I'm not seeing the next term. Oh, there, nope, still not seeing the next term. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, amputee. Yeah, this one's tougher. Oh, maybe not as tough. Okay. So while we're waiting for folks, I just saw, I told you I wasn't monitoring the chat, but I did see that Aaron jumped in. So when we're talking about substance disorders, are we talking about substance use disorder, substance abuse disorder, or misuse? That's a really good question. And I apologize because I had been saying substance abuse disorder. And it is substance use disorder. So that's what we're supposed to be saying. So remember, so think about kind of like the substance use. There's nothing actually wrong with substance use. It's when it becomes a problem that it becomes the disorder. So like I can take my prescription drugs and be fine. And I'm using substances, but I have a disorder when I'm not taking them properly. I can't go without them. And actually had this happen to me. I had spent a lot of time, I used during the healing process for DID, there's two things that I needed to kind of help me get through that healing process. One was an antidepressant and one was an anti-anxiety medication. And the anti-anxiety medication was a benzodiazepine. And so when I was using Klonopin, which is the one that I was prescribed, it's really easy to get addicted to Klonopin. And I got addicted to Klonopin. And so I went from being a person who was using a substance to being someone who had a substance use disorder when I couldn't function without that medication, when I was using it differently than what it was prescribed. So it's the substance use disorder as opposed to substance abuse disorder. And misuse is also a term that we're trying to be careful with because it's judgment laden. So I hope that's helpful. Language is really and the reason I kind of picked these terms is because it's hard. You have to look at the context. And this is kind of your best guide, is by looking at the context. Think about the language that you're using, and does that language basically marginalize someone? Okay, so amputee, this is now, again, people first or identity first. So no, it isn't used unless that individual identifies themselves that way. But for the most part, and this is going to be true a lot of identity first language, if the person identifies themselves as an amputee, it's totally fine for them to say that about themselves, but not necessarily for service providers to be saying that about them. So they're a person with an amputation. That's generally acceptable. So this one, again, it's not really clear cut, but and then we're going to lean back on the fact that we have to ask people. But when all else, when you're not sure, people first language is most of the time the best to use. So a person with. Okay, next one, please. Yeah, thanks so much, Erin. I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm all about sharing what I've learned in my life. I'm a little bit of an open book. It's the only way I know how to train is I find myself in the material and then train from that perspective. Okay, autism. So do we use the term autism? And then of course, what is it? And I'll talk about that. We're just answering. Okay, I think that's pretty much, I think that's everybody. All right, so it's totally an acceptable term to use. And autism is, there's actually, so autism is the centering of hearing people. So it's basically a privilege of like where, so you don't caption things, you don't have interpreters, you require people who are deaf to request the accommodations that they need as opposed to applying them. Our whole world is basically, our society is very autist and centers around hearing people. And then we try to accommodate people that have that are deaf. And so the thing here, and our organization at the Vera Institute of Justice, the Center on Victimization and Safety, we actually are working very hard to create a workplace for deaf and hearing people. So we're trying very hard to center deafness in our work. And so we have ASL interpreters that are on staff. We have deaf and hearing ASL interpreters on staff, or hire to participate in all our meetings with our deaf staff. And we're very far from being centering deafness in our work. There's another term that now I'm going to forget. Najma Johnson from Dawn, which is a deaf and is a program in the DC area that serves the deaf community. They refer to the centering of hearing as phonocentrism, as opposed to autism. I love that term because it really, phono is kind of a term of hearing and, you know, centrism. So it really kind of centers what we're talking about in that term, but I've never heard anyone else use it. So autism is still a very appropriate term to use, and it's a discussion of privilege. Okay, all right, let's move to the next one. I'm hoping this is helpful for folks, by the way. Okay. All right, so this one's really interesting. Autism or autism spectrum disorder, either term. Is this still okay to use? Oh, good. Thanks so much, Amelia, for letting me know, and Courtney. Okay, awesome. It's really hard when you're on a platform like this to know if people are, you know, because I'm usually, when I've done live trainings, I can see people and I get cues from what I'm seeing. So, and Rochelle, thank you so much for letting me know that you have to jump off. It really does help. I have to say, I don't mean to be so obviously insecure, but when I see the numbers dropping down in a webinar, I'm like, oh yeah, people are not getting this. So it really helps to know that it's, you know, people are jumping off for another meeting. Okay, so autism and autism spectrum disorder. Okay, so this is a really big one. So this is really, really interesting to me. So yes, it is totally appropriate to use autism. It is totally appropriate to use autism spectrum disorder, and ASD is also very appropriate to use. Here's the kind of interesting part of this. This is where a lot of identity first language from the people with disabilities, from that community, is stemming from. So so a lot of people that use identity first language who cannot imagine themselves outside of the condition that qualifies them as a person with a disability are autistic. And so they identify themselves as an autistic person as opposed to a person with autism or ASD or autism spectrum disorder. But not all people with autism feel that way. And there's a webinar that I did, that I moderated with 2 panel members. And I have a little prompt for that in the PowerPoint, but that I did. And one of the people who was on the panel is Max Burrows, from Green Mountain Self-Advocates in Vermont. And he has autism and he prefers people first language because he feels that he is a person first and then a person with autism second. And if you've seen any of the work or want to learn more about how other people think about it, Lydia XZ Brown is a person, they have a tremendous amount of, they run the, oh, sorry, I'm going to try to finish one of these sentences. They run the Autism Self-Advocacy Network, ASAN. So that's the acronyms, not, and they are actually the advocacy's the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network is very vocal around identifying as autistic first. You cannot separate the autism from who they are. It's a little bit about, it's a little bit like you can't separate DID from who I am. It's the way that my brain works. I can't imagine myself without it. But that group is amazing. And Lydia has written a really powerful piece about identity first language and the challenges even within the ASAN. So, so here you are you definitely want to use the term autism. You can use people first language, which is a person with autism or a person on the spectrum, or a person with ASD. But you are also likely to come across people who want to be referred to as an autistic person. So here's the general rule there. And I'll say this over and over again. The general rule is people first language, and ask the person how they prefer. Everything that I've heard, and also in this webinar, what people have said, and I feel the same way about DID, is that it's one thing for me to call myself plural. It's another thing for somebody else to call me plural who doesn't have it, for example. So it's one thing for us to refer to people with disabilities, which is a very respectful way of referring to people with disabilities, and a different thing to say disabled people. And even though I'll use that interchangeably, the general rule is to use people first language, and then when you're working with someone, to ask what their preference is.
Olga, can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
So I can only speak for myself, but I know from talking with other people that maybe this question, other people have this question too, but I know that, you know, within various movements, and I'm speaking as a person with a lot of privilege, that, you know, there's been a lot of conversation around not asking people who have marginalized identities or who live on the margins to like do emotional labor and educate us. And so I think
Right.
that makes, I can say for me,
Yes.
sometimes it makes me feel hesitant to like ask questions because I don't want to ask them to like teach me something. So one,
yeah.
what are your thoughts on that when it comes to like, when you ask someone, like, what's your preference? And is there a better way to ask than another way?
Yeah. Okay. So really good point. Thank you so much for raising that. Okay. So one, so it'll be a little bit like you ask someone their gender. So one, don't try to learn about someone's disability. Let me see the best way. Okay. I'm going to use myself as an example. Don't try to learn everything there is to know about DID from me, because I have DID. Okay. If I'm working with you and you know I have DID, you can ask me about how it shows up for me, or how do I prefer to think about myself, or, you know, how do I identify and how does that impact our work together? So only in relation to your work together do you ask. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. I feel like I'm not being very clear today. So it really is centering what you need to know from this person about this. When I did I think this was in December, I did a workshop, a webinar here on working with people with mental health disabilities. And the big thing that we talked about in that workshop, in that webinar, was how it's really the challenging part is that some people don't look like they have a disability. It's not noticeable. They have invisible disabilities, right? I'm one of those people. Like, if I don't tell you that I have DID, you don't necessarily know I have DID. If you're a clinician that works with people who have DID, you will pick up on the little things that come up for me. It's this thing I do with my eyes, which all people with DID do with their eyes. It might be because I identify as they, them. It might be because I'll sometimes use we, but otherwise you won't know. So then it's gonna be up to me to let you know if I need an accommodation. So there's a couple things that as a service provider you want to do. One is you want to ask everyone regardless of whether you see a disability or not, if they need any accommodations. And I've got some good videos on this, and I was gonna use those at the last hour of our ableism and racism training, but you want to ask everyone that you work with if there are any accommodations that they need. And if they say, oh no, why would I need any accommodations? You can say it took, we just want to, we just like to make sure that we ask everyone. So if you use that across the board and ask everyone, then it's just part of what you do, and you're making your services and your organization more accessible. And because there are people who are autistic who do not look like they have a disability, they're going to be people that you're going to find out if you ask them if they need an accommodation, and if they say they do. Some people are likely going to say no. Like if you ask me that and I haven't told you that I have DID and I'm not comfortable disclosing that yet, I'm going to say no, and I'm not going to tell you that I have a disability. But when I get comfortable with you, I will tell you, because asking whether you have whether there's an accommodation that you need lets me know that your organization knows that there are some people that need accommodations, that I don't have to teach you everything. Does that make sense? I'm hoping that does.
Yeah, thank you. And I
So-
see some head nods too.
Oh, good. Awesome. Okay. All right. So autism's still okay to use person first language until that person until they say, no, I really prefer, tell everybody I'm autistic. So, okay, next one. Okay, and Alexandra, I forget how many we have left. We still have quite a few, right?
Yes, we have about 17 people left.
Oh, okay. Woofda. Okay. All right. So, and then Courtney, thank you so much. Yes, you put in the chat. Yes, so important. We have this question as part of our intake process, and it has made such a difference. It totally does. It lets people know. I think I said this in one of our webinars. I live in rural Wisconsin, which is a pretty conservative area. And when I was getting my vaccine for COVID, I had this little small mom and pop pharmacy that I was able to get my vaccine. And when they called me to schedule it, and when they called me, they asked me my gender, and they said, "Are you female, male, gender nonconforming, trans, or would you rather not say?" And I was shocked that this little pharmacy in this area was so well informed around gender. Do you consider yourself to be non-binary? The choices were amazing. And so what it said to me was that this was a safe place for me to go to. This is a place that cares about difference and cares about, how they treat you. And so asking about accommodations, I think, does a really similar thing. It lets people know who have disabilities, who need help, like something done differently, whether they consider themselves to be a person with a disability or not, to feel that what they need might be okay. So, for example, a lot of the things that we do to make our services more accessible are universal. It's like trauma-informed work. It's keeping things from being too chaotic, reducing stimulation, lighting or sounds, or having quiet areas to meet with people. There's all kinds of things that universally help people. So you can ask and also let people know, we try to, these are some of the things that we do to make sure that everyone is able to participate in our services, but if there's anything, if you need an accommodation, just let us know. Anyway, and it'd be simple things like, I need to be able to lock my door at the shelter. I need a bathroom that locks. I can't sleep if I'm in a room with somebody I don't know. And there's lots and lots of ways to accommodate people without doing just structure changes. Okay, so is the term blind still okay to use? And it looks like most people are, and this one's evenly split, which is really interesting. Okay, so yes, you can still use the term blind, but you only use the term blind when the person has complete loss of sight, or if they have some sight, they're considered legally blind. And most people will tell you if they're blind or if they're legally blind. And so if you're describing someone who is participating in your program, who has some limitations with vision, then those are terms that are really specific. So if they have some sight, they are usually considered legally blind, limited vision, low vision, or partially sighted. And then also you can use the term visually impaired. I know quite a few people like Najma Johnson, who I talked about, who runs Dawn in the DC area, is a deaf blind person, advocate, service provider. And that's the way that they identify. I've met lots of other folks that will say that they're blind or will say that they're legally blind. So it is still an appropriate term to use. And the way that you would use it is a deaf blind or is a blind person, as opposed to a person with visual impairment. Does that make sense? So, okay, so this one's a little bit split. And then if the person clarifies with you the level of blindness that they have, then that's what you use. And you have that conversation with them. All right, let's go to the next one. See, these are very, very nuanced. Okay, brain damaged. So do we use this term? Now, mind you, we're talking about the work that you're doing and not like medical stuff, unless you're a medical professional. Yep, you guys are all right. We don't use the term brain damage. There's just no reason for it. When I talk about having DID, I talk about kind of how I center it in my work, right? And I talk about it with my colleagues that I work with. I do trainings on it, but I'll talk about the impact of trauma on my life caused a form of brain damage. So I'll say that about myself, but I will never say that about someone else. It's a very, very loaded term. So yeah, so good. I'm glad everybody knew that. Okay, awesome. See, this is really, really pretty easy. Okay, let's go to the next term. Okay, caretaker. So some people, okay, well, I'll just let you guys. And this one I found really interesting. Okay, so now, so no, we're not using caretaker anymore. And here's the thing, caretaker is that you're taking care of someone, right? but really the term that we're using is caregiver or personal care attendant. And personal care attendant is actually the best term to use. So some people have, like I know quite a few people that are wheelchair users that have personal care attendants, that they need to have them in their life in order to be able to do all the things that they do. And so we refer to them as personal care attendants or PCAs. And this was a really big deal during COVID because personal care attendants were not included as, what was the term that we were using? Necessary workers. What was that term again? I forget. The people who still had to work when we shut down.
Essential.
So they weren't essential workers. Thank you. Essential workers. And so they weren't included originally as essential workers. And also they weren't included in the first set of recovery. Like they didn't increase their pay. They didn't protect, like they didn't provide funding, additional funding for them. And that was huge for people with disabilities, that they lost a lot of their personal care attendants and they weren't able to compensate them for the extra risk that they were taking through their essential work. Okay, so personal care attendant, caregiver, not caretaker. All right, so let's move to the next one. These, by the way, none of these are really awful, except for brain damage. None of them so far are really awful. I will let you know when we have terms, when we come up with a term that is kind of really awful. And so far, I think you all are spotting anything that's kind of weird. Okay, congenital disability, yes or no? And this one's a little nuanced as well. Okay, so this one's even. So this is really interesting. Okay, so yeah. All right, so here's the deal. Congenital disability is still okay to use. And really what it means, and I know the first time I heard it, I was like, whoa, that sounds bad. But it actually means that you were born with the disability that you have. That's all it means. Some people will use the term genetic instead, and that is not okay because it's not necessarily in your genes, it's that you were born with this. So, so it's not interchangeable with a genetic condition. It is just that you were born with it. Okay. And that's still okay to use. So for example, I do not have a congenital disability. I have an acquired disability. So I was not born with it, but I developed it really early in my life. But it's still an acquired disability. And that's a distinction in the disability world that's important. So, okay, so let's move to the next one. Okay, cripple. Okay, so everyone's right. You do not use this anymore. There are people who will refer to themselves as crip, but you will not ever use this to refer to someone who is a wheelchair user or who has any kind of physical mobility issues. So it is considered offensive still. So good job. You all knew that. All right, next. See, some of these are super easy. Deaf. And this is with the capital D. Okay, so yes, we are using deaf. Okay, now this one's an important one, and I kind of want to spend a couple minutes on this. So it's first important to understand that many people do not consider being deaf or having hearing loss as a disability. Instead, deafness is often considered a culture. Some people with mild or moderate hearing loss may affiliate themselves with the deaf community and prefer to be referred as deaf with a lowercase d, or hearing impaired or hard of hearing. And that's okay. But deaf with a capital B is identity first language. And so we are using that. And so let me, I kind of want to give you an example. So I work with quite a few people who are deaf, who feel that they're part of a culture. I also work on another project with someone who considers themselves to be deaf with a lowercase d. And it's in large part because her family, so she has cochlear ear implants that there is a little bit of hearing, but for the most part, she uses captioning. And she doesn't know ASL. She uses captioning as her way of being able to keep up with what's going on. Like when we meet on Zoom, we use the captioning service for her to be able to kind of keep up with the meetings that we have. We also are really very particular about one person talking at a time, pausing, waiting for the next person to talk. And that's to make sure that she has access to what we need. So there are people who were raised thinking that being deaf was a disability and have continued to feel that way about the fact that they can't hear. So there's the capital D deaf, that's cultural, and then there's people who prefer to think about themselves person first with a descriptive of being deaf or hard of hearing or hearing impaired. So it's very, very nuanced, but the term deaf with the capital D is, so, and this is one of those things that, so one, when you talk about people with disabilities, you're not necessarily incorporating people, deaf people in it. So usually it's really kind of tricky because you do want to talk about people who are hard of hearing or experience deafness, but then there's this other group who are deaf people who do not consider themselves to have a disability. So it's a little bit of a tricky discussion. So I always say people with disabilities and deaf people. I always make the distinction so that deaf people feel, I understand that they don't consider themselves to have a disability, that they're a cultural group. All right, so that would be, and I know somebody else was really keen on that. Like I saw that right away in someone's response earlier, and I can't remember who it was, but I could tell that they had worked with this issue before, that they were knowledgeable about it. So I just wanted to say that. Okay, so what's our next one? Okay, deaf blind. And I think I told you the answer to this one already, but go ahead. Okay. Yeah, so deaf-blind is still the term to use when someone is deaf and blind. And it is written exactly like this, deaf-blind. So don't ever use the term dumb or mute. Always use the term deaf, deaf-blind, deaf-blind without the hyphen. Both, and you don't have to capitalize blind, but deaf-blind is the way to go. If someone doesn't speak, you don't use the term mute or dumb. Okay, so I'm going to stop there because we're just about out of time. We have about 4 minutes left. So I want to point, so this is the webinar that I was talking about. Max Burrows was the person with autism who talked about how he identifies Sierra, Olivia, Thomas Williams. I love Sierra. I love them both. They're both part of our BIPOC caucus. Sierra has a mental health disability and a few other disabilities, but I think the mental health disability is the one that she identifies with the most. And Sierra talks about how identity first language is really important to her. This is on our end abuse website, on Vera's end abuse website, which is endabusepwd.org. And you'll find it under the trainings tab. It's a really, really interesting panel. And everything we do at Vera, we always have an ASL interpreter to make sure that we have that, that it's as accessible. We also have captioning as well. So if, and this is on our website, if you'd like to see this, I think it's a really great discussion, and it shows you how challenging it is to deal with the issue of language. So as a general rule, use people first language and then ask people what they prefer. And only if this issue is like the issue about their disability is important to the work that you're doing. Okay, so we have just about, I think, 4 minutes. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like me to address in those last 4 minutes? I feel like people asked along the way, but is there anything that we didn't cover? And then let me also, I might have the, let me just stop share for a second. There we go. Let me see if I can quickly find the link directly to that. Yes, I have it right here. Cool. Okay, so this is the link directly to that webinar.
Thanks, Olga. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or put them in the chat. And if we don't get to everyone's questions, we can send them to Olga and they can respond separately. Olga, I don't know if this would be too much to ask from you, but I think because that was like a lot of info, is it possible to get it in a handout, or do you know of a handout that kind of says like what's okay and what's not okay?
Yeah, there's a great, there's the National Center on Disability and Journalism has a really great discussion. In fact, what I'll do is I'll send you a couple materials that I think would be super helpful. The National Center on Disability and Journalism is, of course, talking about how you write about other people. So I think that's a great resource, and I'll send you that. And that'll talk about these terms and other people's terms. But then also I'll send you the, there was this journalist who came out with a blog post on identity first versus person first language, which also refers to Lydia XZ Brown's. So I'll send you that because I think that's really a great discussion about how you talk about this. Now, we are talking about writing, but I feel that the general rule applies across the board. If there's a reason you need to know how to refer to this person, and use people first, unless they've told you that they prefer, like I identify as autistic, I'd rather be called an autistic person.
Awesome. Thank you. That's super helpful. And Alexandra posted in the chat a link to the Disability Language Style Guide, and it's available in English, Spanish, Italian, and Romanian.
Awesome. Cool. Who knew? All right. Well, thank you so much. And thanks, Peace, for letting me know that you appreciate my overall energy. I feel like I was rambling a little bit today and a little unfocused, so I really appreciate it. Thanks, Jose.
Awesome. Folks,
Awesome.
thank you for being here, and hopefully we'll see you next week at our other training, and have a great rest of your day.
And I'll send you that today, Leah.
Okay,
Okay.
yeah, I'll send it out to everyone who registered.
Okay, awesome.
Bye.
Bye.